Okay, so this video is for Cornerstone Academy, and it's on Module 11. And Module 11 gets us started in Kingdom Animalia. So now that we are in Kingdom Animalia, that's the last of the 5 kingdoms. So we did Kingdom Monera, we did Protista, we did fungi, we did plants, and now we're in Kingdom Animalia. So Kingdom Animalia is divided into 2 broad categories. The first category is the invertebrates, and the second category is the vertebrates. So the invertebrates are those organisms in the animal kingdom that have no backbone, and the vertebrates have a backbone. And in terms of phyla within these kingdoms, the vertebrates have only one phylum, and that is phylum Chordata. So every other phylum within the animal kingdom, except phylum Chordata, are invertebrates. So this module and the next module deal with phylum, or deal with the invertebrates, and then we'll spend a couple modules looking at the vertebrates. Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about with regard to the animal kingdom is that most organisms within the animal kingdom have something that we call symmetry. Not all, but many of them do. And symmetry just means that you can divide something into 2 identical halves. And there are 3 types of symmetry. The first is spherical symmetry, and in spherical symmetry, you can any cut through the center will divide it into 2 equal halves. So if you have something that's spherical, it's not exactly straight, but any cut that goes through the center will divide it into equal halves. Radial symmetry is where any longitudinal cut through the center will result in 2 equal halves. And I'll show you a picture in just a moment for examples of these. And then the last one is called bilateral symmetry. And in bilateral symmetry, this is a single longitudinal cut. And it results in left and right halves. So humans have bilateral symmetry. If we have 2 eyes, we have 2 ears, we have 2 legs, 2 arms. So any cut, any longitudinal cut through the center will result in equal left and right halves. Now, obviously, the internally, you're not going to get equal left and right halves because some organs fall more on the left side of the body and some organs fall more on the right side of the body, but in terms of the external structure, you will get equal right and left halves. So here is a picture showing bilateral symmetry in humans. So this cut, one single cut down through the middle here. So a single cut down through the middle results in equal left and right halves. Okay, then if we look at this picture, so here on the far left is an example of spherical symmetry where you can see that any cut through the center results in equal halves. So this cut, any one cut through the center results in 2 equal halves. Okay, so that is spherical symmetry. And then radial symmetry is where you can any longitudinal cut. So it doesn't have to any longitudinal cut through the center will result in 2 equal halves. So the sea anemone is an example of that. Okay, so that's symmetry that is present in many organisms within the animal kingdom. There are exceptions, and I will mention those as we get to them. Okay, so in this unit, in this module, we are going to cover 6 phyla. And those phyla are Porifera. And for this one, we will be looking at sponges. Then we will do phylum Cnidaria. And phylum Cnidaria includes things like jellyfish, coral, sea anemones. Phylum Annelida. These are segmented worms. So you've already dissected the earthworm. Earthworm is a member of phylum Annelida. Then Nematoda, which are the roundworms. Platyhelminthes, and these are flatworms. And then lastly, I'll run out of room, so I'll put it up here on the top. Lastly is phylum Mollusca. And that includes things like clams, oysters, snails, squid, octopus. Okay, so a lot of organisms fall in phylum Mollusca, and as you can see, we're being pretty ambitious in terms of what we are going to get through in this module. Okay, so let's start then with phylum Porifera or Porifera. It doesn't really matter how you say it. Phylum Porifera. So we're going to be looking specifically at sponges. So most of the members of this phyla are live in salt water. There are a few that live in fresh water, but most live in salt water. Generally they have 2 layers of cells, and those layers of cells are called, there's an outer layer that is called the epidermis. So we use that same for humans. Our outer layer is also our epidermis, so it's the skin. And then there's a layer that's called the mesenchyme. And the mesenchyme is kind of a jelly-like substance that's going to separate the outer layer from the inner layer. Okay, so we have an outer layer, then we have an in-between substance called the mesenchyme, and then there are an inner layer of cells. In this mesenchyme, there are 2 types of cells. And those 2 types of cells are called spicules or spongin. So when we had lab last week, I passed around some samples of real sponges. Most of the sponges we use in cleaning and things like that now are artificial, but you did get to see real sponges last week. So what's the difference between spicules and spongins? Well, a sponge that contains spicules will feel hard or kind of spiny. And a sponge that contains spongin will be softer. So most of the sponges that we use, most of the natural sponges that we would use in cleaning, or they used to be used a lot in medicine to sop up blood and other body fluids, would contain primarily spongin. And the sponge that I showed you last week also contained that spongin. Now, I would like to try to find another picture. So I don't have a picture. There's no pictures of sponges in your textbook. I want to talk about a couple parts of the sponge that are really important. And one of those parts is called the collar cells. So sponges do not move. So they're anchored to the bottom of they're anchored to the ocean floor. So they are not able to move. So in order for them to eat, they have to bring food to them. So they depend on food coming to them because they cannot move to find food. So the collar cells are a type of cells that have flagella. And what happens is the flagella are constantly beating the water, and by doing so, they are pulling the water into themselves, and then they can extract the water, or they can extract the food, whether it be algae or bacteria or plankton. They can extract it from the water that they have pulled into themselves by these constantly beating flagella. So the collar cells are very important for the feeding habits of a sponge. Another type of cell is called an amoebocyte. And you might recognize this word amoeba. So amoeba have pseudopods. So the amoebocytes is a type of cell within a sponge that has these pseudopods, and those pseudopods help to digest the food that is brought into the organism. The amoebocytes also help to transport things throughout the cell or throughout the sponge. And this is also where the spicules and the spongin are made. So this type of cell is what makes the substance that gives a sponge either its prickly, harder, spiny surface, or its soft feeling, depending on whether it is predominantly made of spicules or spongin. Okay, one more thing with regard to the sponges, and I think we'll be done with them. I want to talk about their reproduction. So reproduction in sponges, first of all, they can reproduce asexually. And the way that they reproduce asexually is by budding. Now remember, budding, we saw this in other organisms. Budding is like a little cluster of cells that would form on the end of a sponge, and then it would grow and then eventually detach from the sponge and become its own sponge. So they reproduce asexually by budding. They can also regenerate, and regeneration is where if you cut a portion away, that portion will grow into a new sponge. So cut a portion away, and it grows into a new sponge. So sponges use regeneration as a way to reproduce. And then a last way that they can reproduce is through something called a gemmule. And what a gemmule is that, and this would happen when there's harsh conditions, whether it be Often it happens during cold weather. So this is a cluster of cells with a hard coating. And that hard coating protects the organism, protects those cells through the harsh conditions. And then when those harsh conditions no longer exist, then the cells break free of that hard coating, and the cells can grow again. So the gemmule is really a way of preserving the organism when there are harsh conditions. Okay, next let's go ahead and do phylum Cnidaria. And phylum Cnidaria, so the C is silent. We don't pronounce the C, and we don't pronounce the C. So this includes jellyfish, sea anemones, and an organism, a microscopic organism called a hydra. And for all of these organisms, they take on two forms. They take on a form that is called a polyp, and they can take on a form that is called a medusa. So the polyp form usually the polyp form is like a more disc-shaped form, and it can still have tentacles, but it's more of a disc shape. And then the medusa is more like an umbrella shaped with tentacles. So when typically the form of a jellyfish that we think of would be the medusa form. And then another one I haven't mentioned it, but the polyp form of this would be coral. But we'll see in a bit that the jellyfish actually go through a polyp form and a medusa form. One special type of cell that we find in members of phylum Cnidaria are cells that are called nematocysts. And nematocysts contain a toxin. And they will, and these nematocysts are on the tentacles. And they contain a toxin that gets injected into either the prey or a predator. So if they are looking for food, they will inject the toxin into the prey and then eat it. But if they are being pursued by a predator, they can also use that toxin to immobilize the predator. So this toxin it can cause paralysis or stinging. So if you, I've never been stung by a jellyfish, but if you get stung by a jellyfish, it's this toxin from the nematocyst that is causing that. So let's look at a picture of a hydra, and you can see. So here's a picture of the hydra, and on this hydra, you can see. Here are the tentacles, but then these structures that stick off the tentacles are the nematocysts. and it is those nematocysts. It usually just triggered by touch or pressure. They will release the toxin into the predator or the prey. So nematocysts, important part of organisms in phylum Cnidaria. Okay, let's look a little bit in more detail now at the jellyfish. So the jellyfish that we typically think of is in the Medusa form, but as I already mentioned, many jellyfish also go through a polyp form during their growth and reproduction. So in terms of reproduction, the Medusa reproduces sexually. We'll look at a figure here, and this will make a little more sense. So this reproduces sexually, and a polyp form can reproduce sexually or asexually. We're going to see in a little bit that there are some organisms that contain both male and female parts. Jellyfish are not like that. So jellyfish are either male or female, but not both. Male or female, not both. Okay, so we'll see that we saw that we saw what we talked about when we dissected the earthworm, that earthworms contain both male and female parts. That's not true of the jellyfish. They are either male or female. Okay, so let's look at a figure now that will show us a little bit about the reproduction that takes place in a jellyfish. Okay, so up here near the top, you can see the Medusa form. So these structures here are the Medusa form, and so here, remember we said that they are either male or female. So here, because the one on the left is releasing the sperm, we know that that one's male, and the one on the right is releasing the egg, so it is female. So what happens in terms of reproduction is that the sperm gets released into the water. So sperm into the water. Okay, then those sperm will swim and they will fertilize an egg from the female, and then that fertilized egg attaches itself to one of the tentacles. So here we see one of the tentacles on the female. Okay, so the sperm get released into the water. They are able to swim, and they will fertilize the egg that has been released in the female, and then that fertilized egg will migrate down to one of the tentacles, and it will stay there and it will grow there. And then once it reaches a certain size, then it is called a planula. Okay, so it gets released from the tentacle, and when that happens, when it in that form, it is called the planula. That planula will then plant itself on the bottom of the ocean floor, and it will start to grow. And in this form, it is called a polyp. So all of these are polyps. Okay, they grow. As they're growing, they're called polyps. Then they will start to form medusas, and you can see that happening here. So they'll start to form these medusas, and then those one or more of those medusas will break free, and then you have a new medusa, and the whole reproductive process would begin again. Okay, so that is sexual reproduction in a jellyfish in the medusa form. Now, I mentioned to you previously the polyp form can reproduce asexually because they can do budding. So this polyp form, any of these organisms here in the polyp form, they can form a bud, and then that bud can, it'll grow and it'll break off and eventually land on the ocean floor and develop into a jellyfish. So both asexual and sexual reproduction can occur in the jellyfish. Okay, so that is all we are going to say about phylum Cnidaria, which includes hydra, sea anemones, and jellyfish. Okay, our next one then is phylum Platyhelminthes. No, I'm sorry, it's phylum Annelida is the one we'll do next. And these are the segmented worms. And so the one that we would look at would be the earthworm. And since we have already dissected the earthworm, I am just going to, and we've already talked about some of the parts associated with it. So what I am going to do is just run through the parts that are most important for you to know. And then we'll look at a figure as we are doing that. Okay, so first of all, with phylum Annelida, you should know that they have bilateral symmetry. So if you think about the earthworm that we dissected, we could have cut that earthworm, down one cut to separate it into two equal right and left halves. And then we talked about that swelling of a structure that is called the clitellum. And this is from about segments 32 to 37. And you saw that clitellum and you cut through it when we did the dissection. So this is like a swelling, and it is important for reproduction that we'll see in just a moment. And we also said that the clitellum can be used, one way you can determine the anterior portion of the worm, because the clitellum will be closer to the front than toward the back. Okay, so let's go ahead and go through some of the most important body parts in the earthworm. So let's first talk about the digestive system. So the digestive system in an earthworm is considered complete, and that simply means that it goes from the mouth. It's a single tube basically that goes from the mouth to the anus. Okay, that's what we mean by a complete digestive system. So earthworms use their mouth to suck in soil, and then that soil will travel through the earthworm in order, and once it leaves the mouth, it will go into the pharynx. And then from the pharynx, it goes into the crop. And the crop just kind of stores it for a while. Then it goes into the gizzard. And when you did your dissection, you saw that the gizzard is a tougher kind of pouch, and what the gizzard does is it grinds the food up into smaller particles, and then it will go into the intestine. So the intestine, as you saw, is the long organism that goes all the way to the back of the earthworm, and it is in the intestine that the food gets absorbed into the bloodstream. So all the nutrients that were taken, have been derived from the food, get absorbed into the bloodstream in the intestine, and then the intestine goes all the way out to the back of the worm, and then waste is eliminated through the anus. Okay, so it's a complete digestive system. Now, one of the structures that we were not able to see when we did the dissection, but you should be aware of, is something called nephridia. And the nephridia are like your kidneys. So they also help to eliminate waste. So your kidneys are called, the functional part of your kidney is called a nephron. So you can see the same root word there, nephridia, are important for eliminating especially liquid type of waste. Okay, then we talked about the circulatory system of the earthworm when we did the dissection, and we said that there are two main blood vessels. There is a dorsal blood vessel that runs along the back, and then of the earthworm, and then there is the ventral blood vessel that runs along the stomach side, or the ventral side of the earthworm. So essentially, and these two are linked together. So linked together by aortic arches. So remember, we said that the earthworm doesn't have a true heart, but they have these aortic arches, and basically what happens is the ventral blood vessel carries blood away from the aortic arches, and then it carries it to the tissues, to the other organs, where those organs take away the nutrients and the oxygen, and then the dorsal blood vessel returns it to the aortic arches. So you could think of the ventral blood vessels carry the blood away, and the dorsal blood vessel carries blood back to the aortic arches. And remember, when we did our dissection, those aortic arches were just those black, really thin finger type structures, and you can see anywhere from a few to up to as many as 10 or 12 in different earthworms. What is an earthworm's respiratory system like? How do they breathe? Well, they breathe through their skin. So they don't have lungs, they don't have gills, as we will see in other organisms that we're going to study, because their skin is so thin that oxygen and carbon dioxide can just move through the skin. So they pick up oxygen from the air and they get rid of carbon dioxide waste, also just through their skin right into back out into the air. Now, in order for them to do this, they do have something that is called the cuticle. And what the cuticle does is that it's a moist layer covering the outside of the earthworm. To allow breathing, or to allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to move across the skin of the earthworm. So if an earthworm dries out, if you see an earthworm lying out on the sidewalk that's all dried, that means the cuticle dried up and they were not able to absorb oxygen, they were not able to get rid of carbon dioxide, and so they die. So they basically suffocate if the cuticle dries out. So it's a very critical structure. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the nervous system. We saw in our dissection that there are these two masses of cells that are called ganglia. So they don't have a true brain, but they do have these mass of nerve cells that are called ganglia. And then they have the ventral nerve cord. So we saw that ventral nerve cord, that shiny white cord that runs along the ventral or underside. And that's how that's how nervous information gets sent throughout the earthworm. So not a true brain, but they do have these ganglia that and the ventral nerve cord that respond to sensory information. Okay, in terms of reproduction of the earthworm, earthworms are hermaphrodites. And what that means is that they have both male and female organs. So they produce both eggs and sperm. However, they cannot mate with themselves. So in order for reproduction to occur, the sperm of one earthworm has to fertilize the eggs of another earthworm. They cannot mate with themselves. And the way that they do that is through something called a slime tube. So what happens in reproduction is that two worms will attach to each other at the slime tube, and they will exchange sperm. And then those sperm will fertilize the eggs in the other earthworm. Once that fertilization takes place, so the sperm will fertilize the eggs. And then what happens is a cocoon forms. And that the earthworm will, the young earthworm will develop in this cocoon, and then after several weeks, the young earthworms will come out of that cocoon. When I said that they form this cocoon is actually formed around the clitellum. So remember I said that the clitellum was important for reproduction. That's because that cocoon will form around that. Okay, so I think that's all we are going to say about the earthworm. Let's quickly say a little bit about Platyhelminthes. So this is the next phyla. Let me go ahead and, when I listed the phyla that we're going to do, the next one is phylum Platyhelminthes. And two of the organisms that I want you to be aware of within so first of all, we call these the flatworms. Because when you look at them, they're flat. And one of the most interesting one is one that's called a planarian. And I don't have time to do it now, but I will send you a video of a planarian. And the reason that they are so interesting is that they can reproduce sexually, but they also can reproduce by regeneration. So if you take a planarian, so here's a picture of a planarian. If you cut a planarian anywhere if you cut this planarian anywhere, so if I cut it here, this tail portion would grow a head. And if I cut it up here, the head portion would grow a tail. So they can reproduce with each other by regeneration. And you can actually, with a planarian, you can take a razor blade and cut the head into two pieces, and it will develop two heads. So they are a very interesting organism. They do not have they don't have true eyes, but they have these eye spots, and we've seen other organisms that have eye spots, and that basically allows them to move toward light. So they will sense light, and they will move toward it, and that helps them to find prey. So the planarian is one example of a flatworm, and I'll send you a video of one so that you can see it. They also are hermaphrodites, so but again, they can't reproduce with themselves. They have to exchange the eggs and sperm with another eggs. The sperm have to fertilize the eggs of a different planaria. But as I said, they can also reproduce by regeneration. So if a planarian tears itself in half, this bottom half will develop a head and the top half will develop a tail, and you'll see that in the video that I will send to you. Okay, then the other member of phylum Platyhelminthes that I want you to be aware of is a tapeworm, or another one is a fluke, and these are parasites. So they live in a host's intestine. And because they live in the host intestine, they do not have their own digestive system because they don't need it, because they rely on their host to digest the food. So once the food has been digested, the tapeworm or the fluke that is living in the intestine just consumes the food from the host. So they don't need their own digestive system. I will also send to you a short video of a tapeworm living inside a woman. This was recorded through an MRI, and you can see the tapeworm moving around in there. I don't have time to include that on this video, but I will send you a video of it. Okay, next is phylum Nematoda, and all I want to say about phylum Nematoda, just a few things. One is that they're very small, and these are typically called roundworms. So they don't have segmented bodies like we saw with the earthworm, and many of these are parasites. So again, as parasites, they live in the host's intestines, and they have these little hooks that they use to attach themselves to the intestines so that they can anchor themselves there and consume the food from the host. Let me see if I have a picture of phylum Nematoda. I guess I don't. I don't think your book has a picture of, actually, in figure 11.10 in your book, if you want to take a look at that, there are some pictures of phylum Nematoda, and you can, if you look there, you can see the little hook-like structures that they use to attach to the intestines. One type, maybe the most common in terms of a parasite member of this phylum, is called Trichinella spiralis. And the adult of this animal, of this worm, lives in the intestines of pigs. But then it migrates to the muscle. So it moves to the muscle, so that then when we consume pig, when we consume pork, then if you consume pork that is infected, if the muscle is infected with this trichinella, then they can reproduce in your digestive system, and they will cause pain and diarrhea. And in addition to that, they also can migrate to the muscles of humans and can cause muscle and joint pain there. So how do we avoid this? The main thing is that they are killed by heat. So cooked pork to a proper temperature. Undercooked pork is one way that a person could get Trichinella spiralis. Not all pork obviously is infected with it, but if it is, it can be killed. It will die with heat. Okay, lastly, we are going to do phylum Mollusca. And this includes things like clams, oysters, snails, squid, octopus. Okay, those are all part of phylum Mollusca. And many members of this phyla have some of the same structures. They have a mantle, which is it's a tissue that holds the organs. Then they have a shell, and as you can probably imagine, that shell is for protection. They have a foot, and the foot is a muscle that is used for locomotion or movement. And then they have a structure that is called a radula, and the radula is covered with teeth, and those teeth are used to scrape food into their mouth. So if we look at this figure of a snail is an example of a member of phylum Mollusca. So they have tentacles. Most of the organisms in this phyla do have tentacles. Some of them might be larger tentacles than others, but they do have tentacles. And in the case of a snail, make that larger. I can't. Okay. In the case of a snail, the tentacles are on the head, and they actually have eyes on the ends of those tentacles. But here I want you to see the mantle. So, well, first of all, the outer shell, the outer part is the shell. Then underneath the shell is the mantle. And so this structure, all this stuff in here is called the mantle. Then the organs are inside that mantle. So here the green, you see the intestine. Down here you see the heart and the blood vessels. Okay, so all of that is the mantle is the tissue that surrounds those internal blood vessels, those internal organs. So you know, some of the similar parts as we saw before. The ganglia is like a brain. It's a complete digestive system that starts at the mouth and ends at the anus. So in that regard, they're similar to other organisms. I do want to point out this radula. So if you look closely here at the radula, you can see that there are these teeth-like. So here's the radula, and you can see small teeth-like structures, and that is used to scrape food into the mouth. When we talk about members of the phylum Mollusca, we use the word we can refer to them as either a univalve. So another word for this shell is a valve. So a shell is equal to the valve. We call it a valve. So we refer to organisms that are univalve, which means that they only have one shell. So an example of that would be the snail. But then there are also bivalves. So a bivalve would have two shells with a hinge usually. And so some example of a bivalve would be like a clam or an oyster. You have two shells connected in the middle with a hinge. When a snail moves, it lays down a layer of slime, and then it glides with its foot along so it glides with its foot along that layer of slime. Sometimes another word that is used to describe a snail and some other organisms as well, sometimes we call a word that is used is gastropod. So pod means foot, and gastro means stomach. And snails have other organisms, they have other organs, but a lot of their structure is just made up of their stomach or intestine and their foot. So if we look at a picture of that snail, so here, all the way along here, this is all foot. And then the gastro part would encompass all these organs that are in here. But as you can see, a lot of it's, intestinal. It's related to the stomach. So we refer to them as gastropods. Stomach, foot. So this foot is a large piece of muscle that they use to move along the ground after laying down after laying down a layer of slime. Okay, so I know that's a lot that we covered, but that's going to be it for Module 11 on the first module that deals with the invertebrates.